Hello, and welcome to the Country Bookshop's event with Tom Standage to talk about a brief history of motion. I will begin by telling you a little bit about the Country Bookshop. We are in downtown Southern Pines, North Carolina, and we are unique that we are a bookstore that is a part of a small community twice weekly award-winning newspaper called The Pilot, which also owns magazines across the state, including Business North Carolina. We are a general bookstore for kids and adults that is a part of a community that chooses to shop with us and share their stories and lives with us and celebrate the people who take a bit of their brilliance and research and apply it to the page for our pleasure and contemplation. It is my pleasure to welcome and introduce one such man today. Tom Standage is deputy editor at The Economist, overseeing its strategy and output on digital platforms, including the web, apps, and social media. He previously served as business affairs editor, business editor, technology editor, and science correspondent. Tom is also the author of 6 history books, including Writing on the Wall, Social Media, the First 2,000 Years, the New York Times bestseller, A History of the World in 6 Glasses, and The Victorian Internet, A History of the Telegraph. He holds a degree in engineering and computer science from Oxford University and is the least musical member of his musical family. He is married and lives in London with his wife and children. Welcome, Tom.
Hello, it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, well, it's great to chat with you from across the ocean. Your book, as I was reading it, it stunned me about how much I was talking about it randomly with my son, my neighbor. And what I love about this book is that everyone who reads it will pull different cocktail party conversation nuggets from it to just drop everywhere in their lives. But to begin, I kind of want to ask you, as you were researching and writing the book, you've made so many discoveries along the way, I'm sure, but were there any that stuck out to you or that you couldn't stop telling people about as you discovered it?
Well, my wife complains that I seem to spend a lot of time telling her stories about horse manure and horse droppings and the various sort of disgusting descriptions there are of American cities where there's just this stuff piling up in the streets. And there's a particularly gruesome description of London as well in the 1890s. So there was an awful lot about horse manure. And in fact, in the acknowledgements, I apologized to her. The book is dedicated to my wife, but I apologized to her for going on about it so much. So that was certainly one of the things I found myself talking to people about. The other one, I think, is that so many of the things that we think are new about transport turn out to be really old. So electric cars, for example, were the best-selling car in America in 1897 was an electric car. And then the idea of having fleets of cars that would kind of carry people around, kind of ride hailing, there were several stabs at that, most famously with jitneys, which originate in Los Angeles in 1915. And all of the arguments people had about jitneys are very similar to the arguments they have today about ride hailing and whether it's safe. And, of course, it's the taxi companies that are the most opposed to it and the transit companies, and they say it's not safe and you shouldn't be allowed to do it. So that was a very familiar argument. And then also this, more broadly, this whole question of whether the transport systems we have in our cities are sustainable. That was a big debate in the 1890s because of all this pollution from the horses. And it's exactly the debate we're having now as we worry about climate change and we worry about our dependency on cars. So that's why I think it's a very timely sort of opportunity to come back and say, well, how did we get here and where are we going next and where do we want to go and could we be rethinking this? So I think those were the things I was most surprised by along the way.
Well, you outline all of that so well, and you do a wonderful job pulling it together at the end, but it is those consistencies over time that come through. One that really fascinated me was the fact that the commuting distance, that human behavior's dedication to a 30-minute commute with some variations goes back all the way. And can you, as we move forward talking about that, can you bring that up? Because that's like,
oh, sure.
I will commute 30 minutes.
No, this is called Marchetti's law, and it's the observation that people seem to be prepared to spend half an hour to get to work and half an hour to get back, and they really don't want to spend much longer than that. And so that's sort of the maximum. And that seems to have been a very constant average over history. And what Marchetti, who was an Italian scientist, noticed was that the size of cities reflects that perfectly. So ancient cities, you can basically walk from the edge, the furthest edge of the city to the center, and that will take you half an hour. And then more modern cities, as transport speeds increased and new forms of transport popped up, and the example he actually used was Berlin. But basically, when you start to get streetcars and you start to get horse-drawn buses and things like that, the size of the city increases basically in proportion to how far you can go in half an hour. And in fact, the average commute now for American commuters who commute by car is still half an hour. Now, obviously, there are people who don't commute at all and work at home, especially at the moment. And there are also super commuters, and these are people who I think a super commuter is defined as someone who has a commute of more than 2 hours in each direction. And the number of super commuters is going up. And in fact, the pandemic may have pushed it up, because if you're only going to go into the office, 2 days a week, then you might be prepared to put up with a much longer commute if you can stay at home the rest of the time. So there are variations, but the really surprising thing is how fixed that is across time. And so if you were an artisan who worked in, an ancient city in Mesopotamia, or in ancient Rome, you would have been walking from your home to the workshop or wherever you were working, and you might have, or if you were a tax collector or whatever, that commute is something that's very fixed across history, it turns out.
You pepper throughout the book, and I'm jumping ahead in my questions, but about kind of the innovations in Scandinavian countries, and you go back all the way well, first, before we go to that, maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Let me get to where my question is articulated in a way that might be helpful for everyone here. But you talk about how the way the roads are organized was never a foregone conclusion. You go back to Rome, where they wheeled activities were in the streets, and they created pedestrian crossways. And the real debate in America and across the world about who did the streets belong to, who was responsible for what was happening in the streets. Can you talk a little bit about that? And
No, that's one of the ways, I think, that's one of the aspects that the cars really took over the world, and it's something that we don't even think about today. We kind of assume that roads are for cars, right? And if you step into the road, then you're an idiot because you'll get hit by a car, and it's your fault if you do. But this is actually a very recent thing, and if you look at film from the early 20th century, for example, there's a famous video of taken on Market Street in San Francisco, but there's other kind of movie footage from the 1890s and the early 1900s. And what's really remarkable is just what a mixture of vehicles and people and things are happening on the streets. None of it's going very fast. You've got horse-drawn carriages, you may have a couple of cars, you've got people walking around, and everyone's just kind of weaving in and out of each other. And in fact, if you go to some parts of the world, that's still how it works. If you go to a town in India, there'll be elephants and cows mixed in there as well. But everyone just kind of goes around each other, and that's how it works. And what happened particularly in America in the 1920s was that motorists started getting quite frustrated that they couldn't go any faster. And there were also quite a lot of accidents. People were getting killed by cars. And so the car industry decided that the way to deal with this was under the guise of a safety campaign, basically argue that roads were for cars, and that there needed to be rules that pedestrians had to follow that meant they got out of the way of cars. And they did things like said, well, you can't just cross the road any old place, you have to cross at the corners or the intersections. And they invent this thing, jaywalking, and they mount these big campaigns against jaywalking, and they drum into everybody the idea that you're an irresponsible citizen if you're jaywalking. But people have been crossing roads wherever they like, whenever they feel like it, for thousands of years, and it's just in this sort of 10-year period that the car industry makes everyone change their minds. And this is one of these many examples where the modern world is the way it is, and it hasn't always been that way. And maybe there are alternatives. And in fact, in some parts of the world, there have been experiments with let's give the streets back to people. Let's pedestrianize them. Let's give pedestrians priority and see what happens. And so that's a way of sort of reminding us that the world doesn't have to be the way it's been for the last century, and there are other ways of doing things.
I want to go back to the 10-year period as they're sorting this out, because as you talk about these alliances of people trying to make sure kids aren't killed on the streets all the time, and the motor industry, and it reminded me towards the end of the book, as you're really focusing on what's happening now, these alliances dealing with the cars that are created now, semi-autonomous drivers, and these alliances, and the fact that the rules have not been carved out yet. And I was wondering, what similarities do you see? What makes it totally different now than back then, as these, it's the right now 10-year period,
Yeah,
basically.
yeah, no, absolutely. So, autonomous cars are. I do have a section on that in the book. They're not working as well as people wanted them to, and effect, there have been these Teslas going into the back of emergency vehicles and so on. The automatic driving isn't as good as people would like it to be, clearly. But also there was that case where the Uber killed a woman in Arizona, and it was because she was wheeling her bike across the highway, and the Uber didn't expect bikes to be traveling. The computer was not programmed to expect bikes to be traveling at 90 degrees to the road. So it knew about what bikes were, but it expected them to be, going in the same direction as the traffic. And so it failed to identify. The computer couldn't decide what this thing was in the road, and it didn't slam on the brakes. It kind of didn't raise a warning. And so there's been all of these debates about what are the responsibilities of people developing autonomous cars, and when we can drive them, if you have got one of these Teslas, what are your responsibilities as a driver when you switch it on? So it is very much a sense, again, that the rules are in flux. And we need to think very carefully about what the new rules are going to be, and that's exactly what happened when the first automobiles hit the roads a bit more than a century ago. And we saw then how particular interests, what was called motordom, which was sort of clubs of car drivers, but also car dealers and car manufacturers, they had particular agendas that they were very successful in promoting. They did things like publish newspapers about safety, that said jaywalking was terrible and that anyone who got run over by a car was basically asking for it. And they would distribute them to police forces. And the police forces would assume that these were sort of impartial newspapers about road safety. But in fact, it was all just a very clever marketing campaign by the car industry. So we need to watch out for the same sort of thing happening now. Who makes the rules for autonomous cars? It probably shouldn't be the car makers. We probably need to be thinking about this a bit more carefully.
Well, as we go, we're into the systems and the codification part of the conversation now, but the spirit of the car and the spirit of, as you remind us, like the magic of moving while standing still is why people are going to pick up this book and want to talk about this everywhere they go. One of the stars and that I am obsessed with now is Bertha Benz and
Yes, yeah,
her
yeah, absolutely.
ultimate road trip.
Well, it's not the ultimate. It's not the last one. It's the first. It's the original road trip. Yeah, no, it's amazing. No, so one of the lovely things about this book, I've been interested in cars since I was a small boy, and there are just so many amazing stories. The exploding traffic light, and and Bertha Benz's ride is definitely one of them. There is just so many crazy bits of trivia in there. But yes, what happens with Bertha Benz is her husband Carl Benz is one of these people experimenting with what are then called horseless carriages, and there's this new kind of engine, the internal combustion engine, and it means that you can build vehicles that go along and they don't need a horse. And so he's building one of these things in Germany in the 1880s, and he's married to Bertha, and she's involved with testing it, and they're like driving it around in their yard and seeing how it works. And she thinks this is great, and he needs to start promoting it and start taking it out into the world. And he's like, no, I still need to refine it. I still have more work to do. It's not ready yet. And so
Such a marriage.
well, exactly. But she thinks what he's got is great, and that he needs to just have the confidence to go and take it out into the world. So the way she proves this to him is one morning she gets the prototype car, and without telling him, she gets their two teenage sons and puts them in the car, and she drives off to see her mother, who lives 65 miles away. So this is a road trip, right? And of course, there are no filling stations at the time, but that didn't matter because this original prototype car called the Motorwagen was fueled by basically gasoline, but you could buy gasoline as a cleaning product. And so there's a pharmacy that she stops at, which has now got a plaque on the wall that says, this is the world's first filling station. Because the first ever road trip in a car, she stops there and buys basically gasoline and puts it in the car. They have a few problems going up some of the hills because the low gear in this car was very, wasn't powerful enough. So the boys had to get out and push. But by the evening, she gets to her mother's house and she sends her husband a telegram saying, "I've taken the car and we've gone to my mum's." And then she drives back again. And again, she needs to improvise a few things. One of the fuel lines gets clogged and she has to unclog it with a hat pin. And there's also a story that she has to use one of her garters to stop a leak. And to prevent a short circuit in the ignition system. And she gets home again and she says, "Look, I've got a few pointers for you. You need to make the low gear a bit more powerful so it can go up hills. The brake pads wore down." So she stopped at a cobbler's and had him put some leather on the brake pads. So she's improved the design of the brake pads. And he says, "Okay, I believe you." And he takes the car the following month, I think it is, to basically a big trade show and shows it to people and says, "Look what I've invented." And everyone just goes nuts. And that's the beginning of the success story of the automobile, because people see that it's not a prototype anymore. It really can work. And he starts to sell them, in the following months after that. So it's down to his wife and her pioneering road trip to see her mum. So when you get in the car with the kids to go and see your mum, then you're following in that tradition of the very first car journey.
Well, I love that, the spirit that comes through in that. And then the spirit of racing and competition is also something I think core to the car enthusiast. And it struck me that consistently throughout the history of motion, betting and racing and competition, they're just cornerstone markers.
Yeah, no, these are, when things go fast, people want to race them, and then other people want to bet on that. So yeah, I mean, we have this with most famously, there's a Roman who's mentioned in the book, and he's like the first, really rich sports celebrity. And he becomes incredibly wealthy because he's the best charioteer. The Romans didn't actually have chariots, so war chariots had become obsolete by the time the Roman empire has come along, and they much preferred cavalry, but they did use chariots for racing. And so in the Colosseum, not the Colosseum, in the Circus Maximus in Rome, they would have this great big chariot races, and so the winning charioteers became very rich and very famous. And then the early history of the car is also very, very tightly linked to racing, because it was these big races. So what really put the car on the map was there were various prototypes, and various people had bought things like the Benz Motorwagen. There were a handful of car makers selling these things, and there was a French newspaper that decided to have a race in 1894 to figure out which was the best kind, because there were steam ones and there were electric ones and there were petrol driven ones. And so they had this race from Paris to another city in France called Rouen, and they said, basically anyone can enter, and they had about 100 cars enter, and about 20 of them ended up doing the race. But what was great was they had them drive in this big parade around Paris, which was a sort of motor show that the people could go out into the street and they could see all these different funny looking cars go past, and they could see the future of motoring sort of taking shape before their eyes. And then they had this race, and people from all over the world came and wrote newspaper reports about this. And so and then they had another one that was much longer, that went all the way down to the south of France. And then in America, people started holding similar races, and it was a way of getting the car makers to compete and build better cars. And this is what motor racing does today. We get new technologies coming in cars. Very often they appear in motor racing first, and then they trickle down to everyone else's cars. And that's been going on since the absolute dawn of the automobile.
And you bring it forward, as you mentioned, to DARPA and today, and it was the race and then the next race that spurned the innovation. And
exactly, with the self-driving car. So you're talking about the DARPA race. So DARPA held this competition because it wanted to see if people could build self-driving vehicles. It wanted to have what it originally wanted was it wanted automatic transports for Afghanistan. So obviously that's very much in the news at the moment. But that was what they wanted. They wanted vehicles that could drive themselves to deliver stuff in Afghanistan. And so they had this competition. And the first competition, people entered these vehicles that were supposed to drive around a track, an off-road track, and it was a total disaster. I mean, the first one, most of them just crashed straight away or went straight off the road. One of them got scared of its own shadow. The best vehicle only went a few miles. And And so it really looked like it was impossible. But then they held another competition the following year. And the amazing thing was just how many of the vehicles then completed that competition. So it was, again, because you've got this competition between different teams and they want to outdo each other and they take ideas from each other, that drove the development of, and that led to all of the emphasis and the activity and research there's been on driverless cars ever since then. Obviously, they still haven't cracked that problem. But once again, you've got this whole idea of a new technology coming out of a race. So racing is absolutely central to this. You're right.
Racing, and what struck me as you're building this trove of information about how individual innovators are perfecting these new machines. You talk about how the bicycle was actually the real precursor to the car with the type of innovations that happened there. And that really struck me when you're talking about the people who are creating these innovations now. What also I wanted to ask you about is in terms of the car, obviously the most well-known, universally taught innovation is manufacturing. But what I was familiar with, but I realized it's not a cornerstone of the general knowledge, was Sloan and the business innovations that came as a result of the car.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. So the way I put it in the book is people are familiar, I think, with the idea that the Model T Ford was the kind of, the first product to be, mass produced in that way. And the idea of a moving production line and the way that this could really get the cost down and the volumes up. And it really is amazing, the Model T Ford. I mean, the number of cars in America on the roads goes up 1,000-fold in 20 years. It goes from 8,000 to 8 million between about 1902 and 1922. And that 1,000-fold in 20 years is basically doubling every 2 years. And doubling every 2 years is what computers do, right? Moore's law, and the way that, processors get, the transistors get smaller and everything gets faster. So this is a computer era. This is building stuff out of metal in factories. I mean, it really is. So that innovation, I think, that was extraordinary, and that led to kind of modern mass production with moving mass production lines. The point, though, yes, is that GM, which was very much sidelined by Ford during that period, GM came up with the marketing genius of having different brands at different price points appealing to different markets and segmenting the market. The Model T Ford, Ford made one product, and it was the Model T for everyone, and it was the same product, and that meant you could really get the cost down. But eventually that design started to show its age. They're still making it nearly 20 years after it was launched, and it's looking really a bit long in the tooth. So GM then steps in and has this much snazzier lineup of cars. It has them in lots of different colors, has lots of different price points. And so the way I put it in the book is, even today, modern products like the iPhone is manufactured like a Model T Ford. It's made in massive quantities on a moving production line, but it's marketed. Smartphones are marketed like GM cars because you have different models and different prices at different price points. And also the model you choose is a form of self-expression. Do you have this model by Samsung, or do you have an Apple iPhone, or do you have some other phone altogether? And so, those ideas about how you manufacture things, but also how you market them, are, again, things that come from the car industry that, maybe we don't realize. And it's just another example of the invisible ways, or at least ways that we're so used to we no longer see them, that the car has shaped the world.
Well, the talk about status and the evolution from people being buried with chariots to then the carriage and stage coaches. I mean, culture is the driver for everything. And I want to go back to that. But when you talk about where we are now towards the end, you talk about how I think 60% of the Chinese do not see cars as a status symbol.
Right. No, exactly. So you're absolutely right. Status is a big part of this. So the first wheeled vehicles, some of the earliest ones we see in Mesopotamia, and the king basically goes in them to go to the battlefield, and so it means he's up on a on a raised platform. He can see the battlefield really well, and he doesn't have to do anything. He's just magically transported there on the back of this vehicle. And there are images of this from on something called the Standard of Ur, which is an ancient kind of wooden box from Mesopotamia that's about 4,000 years old. So, this idea that only the very richest people could afford to travel in these vehicles. You start off with that, and then they become when the war chariot is invented. They become again very high status. The warriors. You look at the kings of Assyria; they're depicted, or the kings of the pharaohs of Egypt. They're depicted in these murals, and they're on the back of a chariot, slaying the enemies, and they've got their bow and arrow or whatever, and they're being victorious in battle. And those cultures, and Greek and Roman culture, also imagined that the gods traveled around in chariots. And so chariots became the highest status vehicle. But then what happens is horses got big enough that they could carry fully armored warriors. And so then we get this whole period where you have knights, and the glamorous, chivalrous knight, and he's got all his armor and he's got his sword and shield. He's not going near. In fact, it was deeply embarrassing in that period for a knight to be on a vehicle, to go on a wheeled vehicle. That was a big come down, because the whole status of the knight was that he was on a horse. Vehicles at that point were for women, and this is where the noble women with their pointy hats. This is where the whole idea of the princess in the carriage, the magical carriage. It's always the princess who goes in the carriage with all the jewels on it, and the great hero is always traveling along next to her. He's the knight, right, in shining armor, and he's on a horse. And then what happens? So basically, men have got to the point where they're like, I'm not going on anything with wheels, right? And this has been going on for about 1,000 years, roughly since roughly since Roman times up to about sort of 1400. And then something changes, and suddenly wheeled vehicles become cool again. So what is it? It seems to be that the invention of cannons and guns means that knights are now obsolete. So suddenly being on a horse, well, now you look old-fashioned, right? And it turns out you can mount cannons on the back of these wheeled vehicles, and you can then take them to a battlefield, and you can set up a kind of temporary castle, and you can shoot at any knights who come towards you using these cannons mounted on the back of these wagons. And so the balance shifts, and people start to think that actually traveling around in a thing with wheels is fine. And this is when the coach arrives, and the coach is named after a particular city in Central Europe. And these are wagons that are much lighter, and they can go much faster. And people start to really enjoy driving them really, really quickly. And you have, 4 horses pulling them along. And so men start to become obsessed with driving really fast, and that becomes really, really cool. And then, from that, we have this idea of, driving fast and having a really cool carriage. My carriage is cooler than yours. It's better decorated. I'm so rich that I've got 2 carriages, and all of this kind of status coming from your vehicle then comes back, even though we've had this whole period where men didn't want to go in things with wheels and they were just for girls. And of course, we've had that ever since. And what I think is really interesting is the signs now that we're starting to see that some people are not so keen on this. Young people are driving less. They're learning to drive later. Some of them aren't learning to drive at all. And in Asian cities, in China, it's very inconvenient to have a car. They're very expensive. The number of people who are allowed to have cars is very strictly limited in many, many cities. And ride hailing is a massive business there. It's much, much bigger. Didi, the leader in ride hailing in China, is bigger than Uber in the whole of the rest of the world. And it's because people don't want the hassle of a car. And so it's become much less of a status symbol. That, I should say, is a very good thing, because if everyone in China and India bought as many cars as people in America did, then, the planet wouldn't have a chance. So I think the idea that we might be moving past the car is a very, very, at least in some parts of the world, is a very hopeful sign.
It did lead me to be curious, what is the status symbol that
it's the phone. It's the phone. Because you take the phone everywhere, you get to customize the ringtone, you get to put a different case on it, you get to, some people have little dangly things they put on the case. It's also the technology that grants you social freedom. So teenagers used to, if you had a car, you could hang out with your friends, right? Now it's one of these, helps you hang out with your friends.
The bike blew me away with the bike.
So, well, earlier you've got the example of the bicycle. Yeah, so the bicycle, when the bicycle takes off in the kind of 1880s, and it's obviously a cheap way to get around. And so it has this big impact on the dating scene, because it means you can get to the next village, right? So the number of people you can go and see suddenly goes up. You don't need to have a horse, but you don't have to feed it. You can just, you can just hide it in a shed and then get on it again. And so it's this, there's this amazing sense of freedom that comes from the bicycle. And in fact, around that time, you've got bicycles and this mania for bicycling, and you've also got steam trains, which go really, really fast. And so that's when people start to ask themselves, well, could you have a vehicle that's personal, like a bicycle, can go as fast as a steam train, but that can go anywhere on any road like a horse can? And of course, that's what the automobile delivers. It's that combination of personal, fast, and versatile. And so, of course, when it comes along, people who can afford it are like, yeah, I'm definitely going to have one of those. And then, of course, now we see the consequences.
Well, and it goes to freedom as a driver for so much. I did, before we get too far away from the carriages and showing them off, so much of the consequences of that you talk about have shaped the environments of cities and the suburbia. But what I did not know was how the parks of great ancient cities come from the practice of coaching.
Yeah, well, so it's not so much the ancient cities. It's
Or not, I'm sorry, ancient.
It's kind of late medieval kind of thing. But yes, when the coaches are really cool, one of the things people want to do is show off to their friends that they've got one of these coaches. And so this starts in Italy, and then one of the Medici marries into the French royal family, and she says, "Hey, we should have a big coaching area." So they build this big park, and basically it's where the rich people show up in their coaches and they swan up and down. And they kind of go round and round. And then when the king comes in his carriage, everyone goes nuts and they try and get close to him, and there's like traffic jams and all the rest of it. And this happens in lots of European cities. And some people make the mistake of trying to rent a coach and then showing up to this event in a rented coach. But then everyone sort of boos and hisses and sends them off in humiliation. Because the whole point is you're supposed to be showing how rich and successful you are by virtue of what a beautiful private coach you have. So yes, it's another one of these examples of kind of you are what you drive. And I think that's still a very widespread phenomenon, but I think we're starting to maybe see the end of you are what you drive. And at least for some people, they're like, I don't really care, I just want a crappy car or no car at all, and that's good.
And the irony that what's left of that culture is the beautiful pedestrian parks in the middle of these cities. And that's what they're used for now.
Yes, that's true. And I think the other interesting way that parks connect to this is that it goes back to the bicycles. So people would be in Central Park in New York, for example, people would be going around in their carriages. And of course, that was something only the rich could do because most people don't own carriages. So when bicycles show up, people started to say, well, we should be allowed to go in the park as well and ride on the roads. And of course, the people with the carriages said, oh, no, we can't just have common people coming around in bicycles. It'll be terrible. But the cyclists won, and the right to drive other kinds of vehicles was granted. And that actually clears the way for the automobile, because then once the automobile has appeared, well, if you're going to let bicycles drive anywhere, you've got to let cars drive anywhere. So in many ways, the bicycle paves the way, in this case, literally, for the car. The other way it does is that if you look at that first Benz Motorwagen and the vehicle that Bertha Benz goes for her road trip in, it's basically made of bicycle parts. So, it's got these big spoked wheels. It's a very lightweight vehicle. It doesn't look like a wagon with an engine in it at all, or a carriage. It looks like a tricycle. So the car really owes a huge debt to the bicycle in all of these ways, which was another surprise, when I was researching this, that I was not expecting.
We mentioned the jitneys earlier in our conversation, and there's similarities to ride functioning today, but you also can you talk a little bit about why they appear, the need for them to appear, and then what happened with the legal and lobbying and different things to make them disappear, and then how that's different from what's happening today.
Yeah, absolutely. So jitneys appear, basically somebody kind of realized that at the time, so jitney is slang for a nickel, which I didn't know, but apparently it is. And at the time, if you went on a streetcar, then it was a nickel flat fare to go from anywhere to anywhere. And so what jitneys were called jitneys because they also charged a nickel to just pick someone up, usually, on a main street, take them into downtown and then drop them off. And the jitney riders would just drive up and down, and they would take several people in the same vehicle. They're just like, I'm going downtown, who wants to come? And if people saw a car going past, they'd wave at it, and if it stopped, they'd get into it. So it's this informal taxi service. And in fact, you get taxi services like this in many parts of the developing world now. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, or you go to the Middle East, or you go to parts of the Caribbean, then they have these sort of maxi taxi style shared taxis. But what's happening in LA is that there's an economic depression is underway, and a lot of people haven't got jobs, but they do own cars. They bought Model Ts. And so this is a quick way to make money, because you just get in your car and just drive up and down and take 5 cents off people. And so when people started complaining about this, and there were lawsuits, and it starts to appear in the newspaper, the idea spreads across America, because people read about these lawsuits and then they go, but that's a great idea, I could do that too. So the jitney craze just spreads across the whole of America very, very quickly. And the taxi companies are trying to shut it down, because this is undercutting the taxis. And the streetcar companies hate it as well. I mean, people would take jitneys because they could often be actually quicker than streetcars, because streetcars have to stop at all the stops, and because they're running on rails, they often get stuck. If there's something stuck in the middle of the road, like a horse, the streetcar can't go past it, but the jitneys can drive around it. So a lot of people really like jitneys. They also served neighborhoods where there weren't streetcar lines, so they were much more flexible. So looking at it more broadly, what there is here, the jitney kind of carves out this space between owning a car and car ownership, which is very expensive but is very flexible. You can go wherever you like, as long as you've got a car, whenever you like. And public transport, which is much less flexible but much cheaper, but you can only go where the buses or the streetcars go, and when they'll be willing to take you. And so, when the jitneys are shut down, that sort of middle option is not explored as much. And I think what ride hailing is doing, and a whole load of other things like electric, bike rental and scooters and all of these other things that we're seeing popping up, they're really kind of feeling out that space between private car ownership and having to take the bus or a streetcar or a tram or something like that, or a train. And we're still having the same arguments about whether they're safe and what the right rules should be. And taxis, there are taxi monopolies in many cities, and taxis can be very expensive as a result. So I think it's good that we explore these other options, because some people are going to conclude that actually they don't want to own cars anymore, and that stitching together these other kinds of transport into what I call the Internet of Motion is actually more convenient and cheaper than owning a car the whole time. And for some people, that's already true. So that's where I think that's the bigger picture here, which is I think some people in the future are going to find that actually owning a car is a less and less attractive option than it is now.
Well, one of the things, and so much, and we'll conclude obviously with so much about the horse time versus now, but as trains appeared, the effect was actually to increase horse use in the city, and the opposite was true.
Yes, absolutely. That was one of the reasons the horse manure problem was getting worse, because the more you have links between cities, and obviously trains, there's this big boom in railroads in the mid 19th century. The more links you've got between cities, the more people and goods you've got coming in and out of cities, the more you need horses and horse-drawn carriages, horse-drawn wagons and things to move those people around within the cities. And so what you see in the biggest, fastest growing cities like London and New York in the 1880s and 1890s is that the number of horses per person is going up. So the horse population is growing faster than the human population, and that's obviously unsustainable, because if the human population is going up by 10%, every year or something, and the horse population is going up by 30% a year, you're not going to have enough room for all the horses. You're going to have more and more horse manure. It was a massive problem, and so that was really, people might have thought that trains would make this less of a problem, make you less dependent on horses, but actually the golden age of the horse was the golden age of the train.
And you talk about this study that blew my mind, this recent study from the University of California, Berkeley, of this more equals more concept. Again, the consistencies through time are what comes out about in the history of motion. Can you specifically outline what that study was and what it reveals?
This is the study that looks at what would happen if we had driverless cars, yeah?
Right. The 2 weeks where if you could
Yeah,
have.
yeah, no, exactly. So this is such a clever study, and obviously there's a lot of people trying to build driverless cars, and they kind of work. And I've been in some, and they're very clever, but they can't do everything, and that's the problem. But there's another group of people who are trying to work out what would happen if we can build them. And I think this is very important because thinking about the consequences of something before we do it that's a step forward, because we didn't do that with cars, right? We just assumed that they'd be better than horses, and the horse manure would go away, and it all would be well. And in fact, we had all these other consequences. So there are people really trying to figure out what would it be like. Suppose we did have cars that could drive themselves perfectly today. What would happen? And there's one of these big arguments is, well, people, would they use them more? If you've got a car that can just take you somewhere, would you take trips that you otherwise wouldn't be able to take because it would be too tiring? Or would you go in the car and do other things in the car? You could read a book while you go and do something else. So we really don't know what the impact would be if these things existed. Would people take more journeys? Would they take fewer, et cetera, et cetera? So there was this really clever study where some researchers, they recruited a group of people and said, we're going to give you a driverless car that works perfectly. And the way they did it was they just gave them a car with a driver. And they said, you can use it any time of day or night. You can ask him to take you anywhere. And then they looked to see how that affected, because people didn't have to drive anymore. And so, it meant they could, for example, if you've got a car that can drive itself, you might go out drinking with your friends a lot more, because you don't have to worry about drinking alcohol and then not being able to drive because you've got a car that can drive. And so they started to look at this, and they found that the number of miles that people travel absolutely shot up. This was all being done in California, in the Bay Area, and several of the people using these supposedly driverless cars, quite a few of them were elderly, and they didn't like doing long journeys. But now they've got a car that can drive itself. They could do long journeys. In fact, they could do long journeys to wine country, and they could drink as much as they like, and then they could get back in the car. And so there was this enormous increase in the use of cars. And so this is one of the concerns that people have, that if we do have self-driving cars, it's going to mean there's a massive traffic problem, because people are going to make all sorts of journeys that they currently don't want to make now, either because they're too tired, or it's too long, or they've drunk too much, or whatever. But once the cars can drive themselves, we may not be able to move for cars. So it was a really, really clever design of a study, and I think it does raise a warning about, if we are going to have these driverless cars, we're going to have to find ways to stop people using them, for these sorts of things, or we are going to have to price roads, or we're going to have to discourage. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to move.
Well, even more mind-blowing to me than that was the second week of the study, where they had a chauffeur at their disposal. They weren't going in the car, but they had that chauffeur.
Oh no, they had the chauffeur. They had the chauffeur all the way through. So some people were also sending the car to, I'm sending the car to pick up my kids from football, and I'm sending the car to, I left something at somebody's house, so I'm going to send the car to them. So they were doing that too, which was another kind of
or go to the good florist across town.
Yeah, exactly. So these are all the sorts of things that people might do if you had autonomous cars that would actually lead to more traffic. And the people who build autonomous cars say, well, there'll be less traffic because, they'll be able to drive closer to each other. And this is what happened with the horses. When we switched from horses to cars, advocates of cars said, well, there'll be less traffic because a carriage and a horse takes up this much space, but if you take away the horse, it takes up half as much space. So there's going to be, the roads are going to be much clearer, there won't be traffic, and the cars will be able to go faster as well because there won't be horses in the way. So this is going to mean an end to traffic jams. And of course, what actually happened is when people saw how empty the roads were without the cars, without the horse, they all started buying cars. And this is what always happens when you build a road and it looks empty, people look at it and go, we could drive a car on that. And they buy more cars, and it doesn't matter how much space you give the cars, they always want more. And so that's a lesson we have to learn, and that's why it's so important that we try and think about these things. If we do end up with driverless cars, we need to avoid making those sorts of mistakes again.
Well, that's what's so interesting, that you leave the reader to walk away from after peppering all just this brilliant, this fantastic information, these nuggets, really, just leaving everybody with some different ways to think about the future, and some examples about, you called it the internet of transportation, but really this web of multiple uses and interconnectedness using the internet technology. But also what struck me is the conversations that are being had now, where it's the end of human error. which that you have a quote from someone in 2019 saying we're going to eliminate human error, and really reminding us that we can't see what we can't see. And I love a consequence that you ask the reader to think about data exhaust.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So it's another unintended consequence, but it's sort of the same idea again. So when we switched from horses to cars, the problem that was being solved was getting rid of the horse manure, and supposedly it was going to get rid of traffic. It was also going to be quieter because cars have rubber tires, and there was supposedly also going to be fewer accidents because a horse can like run away and kick people and be dangerous, and a car can't do that. But of course, the number of accidents went up, and the amount of traffic went up, and the noise went up, and although the pollution, there was no horse manure on the street anymore, the pollution turned out to be a problem because it's carbon dioxide and particles in the air and smog and all that kind of stuff. So again, I'm sounding a warning saying, well, just as you can't just get rid of the horse and expect everything to go on the same way. Even if you get rid of electric, even if you get rid of engines and get rid of and just have electric cars, you get rid of carbon dioxide and you get rid of most of the particulates. But actually, watch out for the exhaust again, because the exhaust that comes from things like ride hailing and things like using a bike rental and scooter rental is that the companies that are delivering that service to you basically know everywhere you've been, and that is scary in a different direction. But you're producing in effect this data exhaust, this information, and so for example, imagine that you've got a city like Washington DC that has electric scooters that you can rent on the sidewalk. And so every time you do that, and I've rented them in DC, in fact, you're basically leaving a record of where you went and where you were at different times. So now imagine there's a demonstration or some sort of uprising that happens in Washington, and the government wants to know who was where when. This is the kind of thing you can look at the records, and some people would say, well, that should be private. You shouldn't be allowed to tell where I was just because I used a scooter or a bicycle. And in fact, what we see in China is that people who criticize the government have some of their transport rights taken away. So if you criticize the government, you can be denied access to domestic aviation. And there's something called the social credit system. So there is this kind of, the question of who goes what and where and when is very political. And so, we need to be careful as we build these new transport systems that do rely on, stitching together lots of stuff digitally, that we do that in a way that doesn't give authoritarian governments the opportunity to basically control who can go where and who can go when. I mean, you could imagine the sort of segregation that you could introduce if you say these kinds of people are allowed to go to that neighborhood and that kind of stuff. So there's all sorts of scary things that could happen with these new high-tech forms of transport, and we need to watch out for that too. So again, I'm sounding a warning.
So much about this book and all your books really speak to culture and the attitudes and the choices that humans make. That is what creates our world. And you just echoed segregation. We did not have time to talk about the environment, but also what struck me, in America, yes, you have the car and all these legal decisions about the car, but simultaneously you have legal decisions about that separation and who's allowed to go where. But your books, A History of the World in Six Glasses, An Edible History of Humanity, Writing on the Wall, and now A History of Motion. I was wondering if we could close. I would love to hear you just talk about your definition of culture and the attitudes and choices of humans, because what you talk about asking us to consider, I would love to.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, those four books are all they're all sort of world histories through a different thing, whether it's food or drink or media or transport. And the point I'm sort of trying to make is that people are people throughout history. I don't think human nature really changes, at least not in this timescale of the last 5,000 years. But what does happen is that different technologies come and go, and different technologies push the same old buttons in our Stone Age brains. And so that's why I think you get these amazing examples of behavior and attitudes and reactions to things being the same across history. Whether it's attitudes to food or drink or media or transport in this case. So really that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make the point that, the technologies themselves come and go, and we shouldn't blame them for things that, bad things that happen. We should blame ourselves. And this is the things that, I mean, whether it's, there are lots of examples of this, but in the media book, for example, Writing on the Wall, I talk about the social media system in the Roman period, and the reactions that people have to being able to send messages quickly, and how similar they are to the way they are today. And so when people blame stuff on a technologies just magnify human failings or human abilities, and so we need to kind of look inside ourselves. And that's really the point I'm making in all of my books. I'm interested in the social impact of technology, and the way people react to it, and the commonalities in the way that they've reacted to it over history. So if there's one sort of thread that runs through all of my books, that's what it is.
Well, it's a treat to chat with you about it. And before I close, is there anything that you want to talk about, or that you've enjoyed as this book kind of makes its way into the world, that you want to share about its reception, or something that you've touched on in other conversations that I missed?
I think the main thing is that this is a book that brings together all of these stories that that many people will not have heard about, this thing that's part of our lives every day, and they won't have noticed the way that it's shaped our world. Fast food, supermarkets, shopping malls, these are all things you can only have if you have cars first. But we kind of assume that it couldn't be any other way. So one of the ways, you said something very, very insightful, I thought, earlier on. You said we can't see what we can't see. And people say that when you have fish swimming around in the sea, they're surrounded by water, but they have no concept of what water is, because they assume that they can't imagine the world being any other way. And so what I'm really trying to do here is show the fish the water. In other words, show people that the world we live in is shaped by cars in all of these ways that we just take for granted. And I think I think that's something that is of interest to people who are, you don't need to be a car enthusiast to be interested in that. It's telling you something about the world in general. And it's full of these stories that I think appeal to people who might not think they're interested in cars, but I think will be interested in, like, how cars have made the world the way it is. So that's what I'm hoping to do with this book. And it sounds as though, you've pulled out all of these interesting little things, and basically the book is a grab bag of these things. And so the fact that you have enjoyed them, I think, is a very hopeful sign that other people will as well.
Well, I've enjoyed them, and I enjoy this conversation and this book making its way through North Carolina. And book clubs are it's largely female oriented, but what I love about this book, and what I will encourage a lot of people to do, especially people who want to show off their awesome cars, is have a little gathering with your friends, read the book and chat about it. What a great excuse for a dinner party, and or an outdoor gathering as COVID sneaks in. But I also think this is such an interesting time for the book to come out in terms of how the pandemic has reshaped the society, and having cars off the street, what it's in this very
exactly. It has given us a glimpse. It's difficult to assess the impact of the pandemic, because I think the long-term trend is away from cars, and we've seen a glimpse of what a future with fewer cars in it looks like, particularly European cities where big areas of the center of cities have been pedestrianized, and we've had a lot more dining on the streets and a lot more cycle lanes, and that's been great. At the same time, particularly in the US, which is obviously much more car dependent, a lot of people are understandably scared about going on public transit, and so there's been actually an uptick in the use of cars, which is why the price of secondhand cars has gone up so much. But I'm optimistic that that's just a blip. I don't think this is this means that there's going to be more and more and more cars. If you look at the historical trends, the number of miles driven per person in the US actually peaked in 2004. So the population is growing, and the number of car miles driven is growing, but the number of miles being driven is growing more slowly than the population. So people are on average becoming less dependent on cars, and I think that's the direction we're going in. But yes, the pandemic has shaken up the kaleidoscope in some quite interesting ways.
Well, Tom, thank you so much for being with us. I want to encourage everyone to get a copy of A Brief History of Motion from the Country Bookshop. We can send to you anywhere all over the world. And I really look forward to hearing these facts come back to me in random conversation as other people deep dive into this. And thank you very much. Before I let you go, what's your next technology that's intriguing you?
Oh, I don't know. I've become quite interested in the history of medicine. My wife's a doctor, so I've always been slightly interested, but I've started to dig into that in a bit more detail. So maybe something in that line. We'll see.
Oh, I hope so, because the a number of books, the way demand for alternative medicine. I mean, we have whole sections now because that's what people want to read about.
Right. Well, this is the thing. So I'm particularly interested in the 17th century, where there's lots of people making their own potions and elixirs and selling them, so and they haven't really figured out how the human body works and how germ theory works. So there's an awful lot of quackery going on, but some of it turns out to have been right. So so I think it's a really interesting period, and I want to go and find out more about that.
Please, and all these new systems that medical has discovered. Well, good. Well, then maybe you can come back and have a conversation. We'll have the hospital maybe sponsor it. We'll have an in-person conversation.
Cool. Thank you very much for having me. It's been great. Bye-bye.
Bye.